You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your squeaking by within the margin of error host, Abraham.
And I am your swing host, Shane.
We are a psychology podcast. We talk about all of the things that people do and feel and behave and what animals do sometimes and maybe plants here and there. And sometimes we talk about the systems that people have put into place that are just, they're bad. They're bad at being systems.
Yeah, and also they name them bad because this is not a college.
No, correct. Yeah. This is the second part in a two-part arc we are doing, talking about something that humans do called the Electoral College, Part 2, Electoral Boogaloo.
That makes me laugh too. I wrote that and it still makes me laugh like that.
Yeah, all credit to Shane for that awesome joke that's been making me chuckle for like over a week. Anyway, so if you're joining us for the first time here, you may want to go back and check out that first episode. In it, let's do a quick recap of what we talked about. We mostly went over the history of the Electoral College, as well as going over some specific examples, and there's only been a handful, in which the candidate who won the popular vote, or lost the popular vote, still became the president of the United States.
To sum all that up, there are a lot of kind of interlocking, strange systems and voting processes that could mean that somebody that most people don't like, or at least a good majority of people don't like, we could even say 3 million people don't like, could still be the president of the United States.
Exactly. That did happen, and it is happening with increasing frequency right now. Mm-hmm. At least it seems to have been going that way. So it was worth digging into what the system is and why it's allowing something like that to happen. And I think that was mostly sort of unpacking history last time. And so this discussion is going to instead be talking about the arguments that people make for and against the continuation of the system and what, if anything, we can do about it. So first, it is August 28th, which means Happy National Cherry Turnover Day. If you're into pastries and snacks.
Love pastries. That's my problem. That's why my nutritionist is so mad at me right now. It's also National Bow Tie Day, which I cannot wear because ties make me gag.
I learned how to tie a bow tie. It's actually not terribly difficult.
I'm not surprised that you would have that skill. I love that. I love that you do, but I am not surprised that you have that skill.
I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah, it absolutely is.
Okay, great. It is International Read Comics in Public Day, and private too, if you want to, I guess.
Yeah, don't be ashamed. It's Dream Day. Ooh.
Interesting. It is Crackers Over the Keyboard Day. Mostly what they're recommending here is turn your computer upside down, or your keyboard upside down, and shake the crumbs out of it, or get the compressed air can and spray the crumbs out of it, or just don't eat food on your keyboard.
Yeah, good idea. I like that. It is National Power Rangers Day, so go Power Rangers,
nice.
Which has the most 90s theme song I've ever heard.
It really, yes, it is archetype of 90s theme songs.
Yeah.
It is Race Your Mouse Around the Icons Day, and by mouse we mean computer mouse, like a trackpad or something, and I guess just zip around your screen for some reason.
Yeah. It's Radio Commercials Day, which, I'm fine with them until it's the ones with the police sirens in the background, and then I get really worried.
That is a terrible idea for a radio commercial. Oh, man.
So mean.
Oh, geez. All right. It is Red Wine Day, unless you're a white wine drinker, and then it's no wine day.
Yeah. It's fine, I guess, if you like old grapes, too. It's Tug of War Day.
Oh, all right. Willing to Lend a Hand Wednesday. Oh, that's lovely. Very nice.
I like that. It's National Composites Day, if you like composite materials.
Composites Week, actually.
I'm sorry. It's week. It's the whole week.
The whole week. Yeah, this is celebrating and bringing awareness to the fact that we build stuff, I guess.
Sure.
It is Be Kind to Humankind Week. And I feel like if anything is a theme of our values on this show, that is it.
That is the one thing. That's what Kurt Vonnegut says. If I know one rule, then God damn it, you've got to be kind. It is Break Safety Week.
Like taking breaks from work?
Well, that too, maybe. I mean, if you want to, but I think mostly just making sure your car works or your bike works or your unicycle. Well, unicycles don't have brakes usually.
Whatever vehicle that moves and needs to come to a stop somehow.
Yeah. Whatever you need to use to stop your wheels.
Sure. It is Health Unit Coordinators Week. That sounds very important.
That does sound very important. It's National Safe at Home Week, which everybody should feel safe at home.
Yeah, I've been waiting for that one.
Yeah.
It is World Water Week. We all get water this week. Congratulations.
Yay. Thirst quenched.
Thirst quenched. Okay, now, as I mentioned, although we do like to celebrate these holidays, or at least acknowledge them briefly at the top of our discussions, we are actually here to talk about the Electoral College. If you have already been with us, we're happy you are continuing on. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. We're happy to have you. If you like what you hear today and you would like to support us, you can head over to our Patreon. There you'll get access to some bonus content. You can always leave us a rating and review, like and subscribe, pick up some merch, or go tell a friend, or destroy the Electoral College and say that we inspired you to do it, and we would be very proud of that legacy.
Yes.
But let's instead start with the arguments that people make for keeping the system as it currently exists in the Electoral College. And I guess before we even jump into that, let's do, because I sort of did a brief recap over what we discussed in the last episode, but in case people are joining us for the first time and do not feel inclined to go check out that last one, or just in case you need a quick refresher, let's just give a really brief description of what the Electoral College is.
The Electoral College is not a place, and it is certainly not a college in the university sense. Basically what it's a group of people that elect the president of the United States based on a lot of strange rules in every state. And ultimately what it is like every state has a certain amount of electoral votes. They have points, if we count them as points, if you want to say that. But every state, depending on their population and depending on how many representatives and how many congressmen they have, or congressfolk, I should say, they get points that are used to elect the next president in every presidential election.
Yeah. So when we cast votes as citizens, what happens is that we have a winner takes all system for the state in which we live. And so whoever gets the most votes in that state will get that state's entire slate of electors to vote for that candidate. No matter how close the margin was, whoever got the most, it could be by one single vote, that person gets the entire slate of electors. As you said, they get one for every congressperson that they have, which means 2 for the senators, and then however many for congress people. This means that the smallest number of electors a state can have is 3. And it also means that this really heavily gives much more voting power to states with small populations. Because states with large populations, although they do have more House of Representative members, they do not have more senators. And states with small populations have a minimum of 3 electoral votes, even if they have proportionally much smaller populations than some of their larger population states nearby.
Right.
What tends to be the case then? Well, in most of history, what has happened is whenever a candidate wins a state, they get all of that state's electors, and most of the time, most of the votes go towards that candidate. That candidate gets most electors that become the president. But in about 5 instances throughout history, there have been times when the candidate lost the popular vote, but happened to get enough votes from the electoral system that they became the president anyway, mostly because they were able to squeak by with the majority of votes in many more small states, even though they didn't get the majority of votes in some of the larger states. And that wasn't the case for all of them, actually. Some of them, there were different reasons that the person who won the popular vote did not get elected, but that's mostly, or that is how it is mostly shaken out in the instances where the person who didn't win the popular vote became the president.
Right.
Anyway, I think that more or less rounds out the discussion of just understanding how the electoral system works. So it's really not a place, it's a process. And as I said, it tends to favor low population states. So let's get into the arguments for why people think that we should keep this system in place.
Yeah, so one of the most consistent arguments made in favor of the Electoral College is that the decision to choose the president would rest in the hands of only the biggest cities and biggest states, making the voice of the less populated areas weaker when choosing the leader. So the concern is that more densely populated areas have more power than places that are less densely populated.
Because there's more people there. Exactly right.
Right.
Now, I don't know if you're hearing the rebuttal that we're going to be forming in your mind already. But essentially, we're not gonna make our rebuttals now. We're gonna go through all the arguments, and then we're gonna go through the counter arguments, and the counter arguments will make many of our rebuttals.
Yes.
So we'll just let them say what they're gonna say. So that's one of the arguments. It would put all this power in the hands of more populated areas. As heritage.org put it, quote, would reshape our political landscape by concentrating power in our largest states and cities. The tribalism and mob rule of which the founders warned would be realized, and the voices of smaller states would become marginalized, end quote. And that's their opinion that they have posted on their website as their position on this.
Yes. One source went so far as to point out that the Senate helps ensure that all states are represented equally by giving each state 2 senators, and the Electoral College works exactly as intended. It makes it so that just having the raw votes to win doesn't matter as much as having a geological balance. Geological balance.
Yeah, that's definitely one key part of that sentence. The other that stands out to me is not just having the raw votes.
Yes.
We don't want that. We don't want to just have the votes.
Uh-huh. We just want to make sure that the bullet points are highlighted and bolded for you as
That's
we
right.
talk about their arguments.
Imagine underline, highlighted, bold, italics.
Yes.
We want to make sure they don't win by just raw votes, they say. Okay.
They want geological, they want land balance.
Land balance. Okay. All right. I want to continue, but let's go on to our next point here.
Sure.
Another argument, another similar argument is that in the electoral system, or without the electoral system, presidential candidates would only campaign in the most populated areas and address issues relevant to those larger areas, and would be less likely to campaign for and address issues in less populated areas. And that in this case, presidential candidates would then just ignore states such as Maine and Vermont because they are not that populous states. They don't have as large of a population as other states. That is an argument that is also made.
Okay. Another argument, surprisingly, is that the Electoral College helps preserve the 2-party system, which helps prevent a large number of candidates from different parties being on the ballot. So if you're ever worried about the 2-party system, that's one of the arguments that's being made for the Electoral College.
Yes, I think it's fun. Again, I'm trying to avoid getting directly into counter arguments, but
I'm trying so hard.
Yeah, you hear the argument for keeping it is to help preserve the 2-party system, and I'm like, an argument for getting rid of it is because it helps preserve the 2-party system. I think
right.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there. We will land that plane. Don't worry.
That's right. Finding strength within. All right. Moving on. Mm-hmm. One source suggested that without the Electoral College, a candidate could win the votes of only a few of the states with the largest population, winning not a single vote in all of the other remaining states, and still win the election, is essentially the arguments that they're making.
Yeah.
Because of the states with big populations.
Right. Some have pointed out that we just have other bigger problems to worry about. The electoral system is written into our Constitution. This means that to change it, it would require a 2/3 majority in both the Chamber of Congress, as well as ratification from 3/4 of state legislators. The fact that this has been proposed over 700 times without success shows how difficult it will be to pass.
That is a critical point. And we actually did mention in the first episode, the reason, part of the issue here, when they wrote the Electoral College and they sort of didn't really hammer out the details because there are some nuanced things that have come up in this system, is we sort of made the joke that they were like, good enough. I guess we'll figure out what happens. But the way that they wrote it, because they made it part of the Constitution, is that to change it is nearly impossible. Not impossible, but nearly impossible. Like it's very, very hard. Like, how often do we get a 2/3 majority on anything in both chambers of Congress and then get that ratified by 3/4 of the states?
Yeah.
In the time that we're in, there is just not that much agreement on any one issue, I think.
No, almost never. Almost never.
Okay, we only have 2 more arguments to cover in favor of this. Another for the Electoral College is that other democracies around the world use electoral systems. So it's not like using Electoral College is totally without precedent, because you can find this in other democracies around the world.
Yeah, so the argument that they do it, so we can do it too. If my friends jump off a bridge, I would go.
Yeah.
And the last argument is, there is, of course, the, quote, this is the way we've always done it argument, if you can call out an argument. And that's actually an argument that people make. We've always done it like this. The country was founded on this, so why would we ever change it?
That was actually kind of one of the points that heritage.org made. They're like, this is the system we have in place. We've had it for a long time. I'm like,
right.
We had slavery for a long time. That wasn't a good idea.
Yeah, we were able to get rid of that.
All right. Well, we had mentioned before that it is Radio Commercials Day, and we're kind of radio, so here's some commercials. All right, let's get back to our discussion here about the arguments for and against the Electoral College. And now we have concluded the part where we try and, with a straight face, make arguments for the Electoral College, and can now instead turn to the, I guess you call them rebuttals, arguments for eliminating the Electoral College or against having that system at all. Maybe just common sense is another way we could describe these statements that we're about to make. But let's go ahead and dive right in.
Yeah. I call the section, we get to be ourselves now. So let's take these arguments in reverse order. We're going to talk about the rebuttals kind of going backwards from what we just described, right? So going to this is the way we've always done it argument. That was also used way back before the germ theory of disease was kind of, came about.
Yeah.
And before that was used to prevent policies that would require doctors to wash their hands between surgeries and resulted in massive numbers of preventable, unnecessary death. So this argument is so bad. It's the anti-science argument, right? It's the anti-data argument. We've always done it like this. Why would we ever change it? Well, we have data to say that it doesn't work.
Right.
And so we're going to do something better and different. So the argument is so bad, it should almost be used as the argument for doing something. Because if someone says this, they are wrong in principle, even if the rest of their arguments are sound. If your argument is always, this is how we've always done it, then you are already missing the point of anything, of doing anything.
You're on the wrong side of that argument.
Yeah. Immediately.
Yeah. Stop it. Just don't include that, and you'll be in a better position. Okay,
right.
Great. So that's just a bad argument. Logically, conceptually, theoretically, practically, it sucks. All right. The argument that we're now addressing is the one that other democracies use an electoral system. There are other countries that do use sort of electoral systems. However, no other country, none, not one, uses the electoral system the way that the United States uses the electoral system.
Sure.
Most of the other countries that do have electoral college systems, they actually use them to elect senators or some other kind of legislators, members of parliament could be one. If we look at Myanmar, Burundi, Estonia, India, Madagascar, Pakistan, Nepal, Trinidad, and Tobago, Vanuatu, and Vatican City, these are all places that do use a sort of electoral system in which electors choose the head of state. But those electors are not always even representing the actual votes of real people.
Right.
Oftentimes they were just elected to their position, whatever position that might be, without any idea or concept that then they would be choosing a specific candidate on the behalf of the people who elected them. They just get to pick, choose, and appoint that person to that position. So that a very different system. Nobody uses an electoral college the way that we do to choose their head of state. So just because other democracies or versions of government that kind of look like democracies use an electoral system, none of them do it the way the United States does it. And certainly no like developed countries with democracies do it the way that we do it.
We're number one. We're number one. Further, in places where the head of state is chosen by an electoral system, the head of state is largely a symbolic position with very little power. The actual power rests with the prime minister, who is never directly elected by the voters, or at least we couldn't find any examples of this. But no democracy, no country at all uses an electoral system to choose the head of state in the same way that the US does it. More than half of the countries that elect a president do not use an electoral college at all. In 33 of 41 countries that directly elect the head of state without a prime minister, the head of state is elected by the popular vote. In 22 of those 33, the winner must have an absolute majority of the popular vote.
And so for that reason, they'll often actually go several rounds of voting that'll sort of weed out candidates. And so it's like they'll have a round with a whole bunch of candidates. Most of them don't get enough to stay in. They'll do another round, and they might have 2, 3, sometimes more. But that's essentially the different systems. But they always are based entirely on the popular vote entirely.
Right.
Just whoever got the most votes wins. You know, like a voting system.
That's all. That's all we're asking.
Okay. The next one here is this argument that like we've got bigger problems to solve. First of all, that is an argument that is used in bad faith in many places that I wish I had some examples right off the top of my head. But a lot of times people, it's the sort of whataboutism argument. It's the like, you're bringing up a valid argument, and rather than addressing that, I say, what about this? I'm like, we can walk and chew gum.
Right.
We can acknowledge this thing and have bigger problems. We can find joy in the world and also understand that there are serious problems in the world that need to be addressed and fixed. It's like, I'm not going to withhold my ability to laugh for the rest of my life until all problems are fixed, right? That's a nonsense way to go. I can do both of those things. Anyway, the idea that the Electoral College is too small of a problem to worry about means that the policies and actions of the president aren't very important. Like that's essentially what that would imply. President doesn't really matter. So why would we worry about trying to fix this system? If we had a prime minister in the United States, that would be true. But given that we have the most extreme candidates imaginable anymore, the idea that this isn't a pressing issue seems patently false. And as we talked about in the last episodes, most people tend to agree that is not accurate.
Right. Exactly. Now, the argument that a candidate would win only by winning a few states without winning votes in the other states is kind of true, but also very misleading. Essentially, what they were saying before was that, okay, larger cities would win the election, so like we need to balance it out by having a higher percentage of a voice essentially for smaller places, right?
Smaller states specifically, yeah.
But without the Electoral College, the president wouldn't win states. They would win votes.
Yeah.
Period. They would win raw votes. The raw votes they were so concerned about.
Yeah.
They would win those raw votes. This means that they could win the majority of the votes, even if those votes happen to be concentrated in certain geographical regions. We'll expand on this when we address other arguments. But all this is saying is, if somebody has more points, they win.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
The NBA Finals works because the team that wins has the most points at the end of the games that they needed to win. They win games. They have the most wins. They have the most points in those games. It's points.
That's how I'm given to understand it. Yes, the most points wins.
Yeah, in most games, yes.
But yeah, the really key element of this argument is understanding that like states basically don't exist if we move to a popular vote. I mean, they exist as far as having like a government that's unique to that geographical region.
Sure.
But as you said, the correct way of thinking about this is that candidates would no longer win states. There's no boundary. They would just be whoever got the most votes. So there aren't states with respect to how.
Right.
And they're sort of saying like, but they'd be all concentrated in where the most people are. I'm like, yeah, most people are there. Like, right.
Which means when they campaign, they would campaign to people. They wouldn't campaign to states.
Yes, exactly. Like, I gave the example in the first episode about like having an office party. We were choosing the type of ice cream. Let's imagine that we were like let's imagine we're all in high school or something and we're having a school assembly and we're all going to vote on
graduation song. We're
going
to vote on our graduation song, and then everybody votes for Vitamin C's graduation song when it should have been Freebird.
Well, hold on. We need
That's
to
a
lay out
very
the context
particular
a bit more.
experience for me. Sorry.
So first we get everybody in the gym, and then we basically most of the people happen to go over where like the AC unit is because it's really hot and they're trying to cool down a little bit. So they're over kind of by the AC unit, but there's definitely a few people sort of around the other places of the gym, and we say, stop, you can't move anymore. Now what we're going to do is have everyone vote, but the people who are not under the AC unit, their votes count more because we don't want the people who are under the AC unit to have that much voting power because they're over there and not over on the other side of the gym. Like that's basically the argument that we're making here is like, you happen to be over there. Therefore, your vote shouldn't count as much because we don't want that side of the gym to have so much voting power. I'm like,
right.
I don't think that side of the gym has anything to do with it. Anyway, sorry, getting ahead of ourselves. We need to move on.
Yes.
Okay. As we mentioned, the two-party system thing. Sorry, I need to cool down by a minute.
Fraba.
Good callback. Or reference. I guess we never made that joke, so we couldn't call back to it. But we talked about this two-party system.
Bad Boys too.
The argument being that like it helps preserve the two-party system. Well, the polls show most people don't like having a two-party system. Helping to preserve the two-party system alone is an argument to get rid of the Electoral College, even if none of the arguments were there.
Right.
The system fosters a tendency toward the most extreme candidates and wide, contentious political divides across the country. Many people just want more and different choices, and they have said this over and over again in polls. Even those of us who feel pretty tightly aligned with our own parties don't necessarily see the option of other parties as being a terrible thing if those people had the real opportunity to be represented in the government, because those are people who are here who do want their voice to be heard.
Right.
So unlikely they would necessarily make it to the presidency, but we also only have two actual parties really being represented in Congress.
Now, the argument that presidential candidates wouldn't campaign to smaller states, it's demonstrably false. So the overwhelming majority of candidates' time is spent in battleground states. That is, states with a high electoral count that have a relatively even split of those Democratic and Republican voters, right? So like you'll hear the term swing states a lot because they can go one way or another because of that kind of equal split. So they actually spend more time in those places campaigning to help swing the vote in their favor.
Yeah.
The Electoral College means that candidates only need to focus on winning those largely populated states. They only need to go to the places with the most points. They don't need to go to Alaska or Maine or Vermont because there's not as many points to win there. But they need to go to places like Ohio and California and Florida and like different places that have a high concentration of these votes. So what ends up happening is the candidates need to focus on these largely populated states where the votes are not guaranteed. They will do little campaigning in other states, but states don't matter to a candidate when they must secure the popular vote. So if they had to secure the popular vote and votes mattered as a 1-to-1 ratio, one person to one vote, and when every person gets the vote, then the candidate is incentivized to spend time in the most populated areas, but also get votes wherever they can get them, which means smaller areas because every vote matters.
Exactly. That is exactly, I think, another one of the most key points here. And yeah, actually, to contradict one thing you said is political candidates rarely campaign in California,
right?
Which has like the highest number of electoral votes. And the reason is they don't really need to. It's like Republican candidates, they're unlikely to get enough votes there to get all of the electoral votes. Democrat candidates have it locked down. So they really spend it in the sort of 6 or maybe 8 states where it's not guaranteed. So they're going to be they historically have been in Florida, as you said, Ohio, Pennsylvania, recently Michigan. So there's like a handful of battleground states where they're going to spend a ton of money and a ton of time. But as you were pointing out, the point is when they aren't trying to get electors, they're trying to get every vote they can, which means that they need to spread their campaigning out more.
Right.
Wherever they can get a vote, that vote will count for them, because if they know that they can't squeak over the margin of 50%, there's really little incentive for them to campaign there at all. Versus if they are going to get any votes there, they want to get as many as they possibly can. So they're going to campaign pretty much everywhere, because it's like some states that might have like 45% and they don't win the plurality of that state, but they still got 45% of the votes in that state, and they need those if they're going to secure victory. Right. So that's why it matters.
Well, and to that point, like, think about it like this. Like, so you're in a state that is maybe guaranteed. Like, let's go back to California, right? So you're a conservative candidate and you don't even bother campaigning in California, because why would you? Why would you? Because you're not going to win that electoral vote. But the problem is that there are people who are your constituents there. There are people who are going to vote for you. There are people who want to hear from you. There are people there that want to hear what policies you have that are going to impact them, and you don't even bother giving them the time of day. So like, the Electoral College doesn't just de-incentivize campaigning into these states. It also makes it so that your voice for your candidate in a state where maybe you're not going to win the electoral vote, like, your voice doesn't really matter that much to the candidate that is currently running, because your state is not going to go to them. Right. So they're not going to bother for you. They're not campaigning for you. They're campaigning for the people who are on the fence in Florida or Ohio or Pennsylvania. And that is kind of sad.
Yeah, it specifically disenfranchises voters of the non-populist party in states that are unlikely to ever vote for the other candidate. So, like, those, just as you said, like, how disenfranchising is it to be a Republican in California, where, you know, like, yeah, I'll go vote, but like, what good that'll do?
Right. They're not doing anything for me anyway.
Yeah. Or like Democrats who live in, like, let's say Idaho, all two of them. Like, what? Why should I go vote? Like, oh, Idaho's never going to vote for the Democratic candidate. Like, that's not, that'll never be my choice.
Right.
And so, like, I think it specifically disenfranchises voters because their voices don't matter in states where they're not battleground states.
And disenfranchises voters that want to vote. Like, that's the thing. Like, there are people that already don't want to vote. There are people who are involved in politics that don't want to be involved in politics because they never get a chance to be heard, because their candidates never bother to take time to visit them.
Exactly. All right. Now, there's more to say on this, and we need to cool off. And what better way to do that than forcing everyone to listen to ads? We've been talking about this whole argument about battleground states and the idea of them campaigning. And again, the logic of this argument doesn't actually make sense, really. So let's just say, even if it was true that small states wouldn't have candidates campaign there, which it isn't, that assumes a couple of things about those states. One, it assumes that they want candidates campaigning there. Probably some people do.
Right.
But there's definitely, I think, campaign fatigue in the United States, because we have no real restrictions on when you can start campaigning, and except for essentially how much money they can raise. And so we spend like 2 years not in campaign mode, and the rest of the time is like campaign mode. Maybe 2 years, maybe it's a year and a half, maybe it's only a year. It's like we're always being campaigned to about candidates, and it sucks. So I don't know that that assumption is necessarily true, although it probably is for some people. The other assumption is, it assumes that the people in those states would rather their votes not count to then have incentive for the candidate to campaign there, assuming that was a legitimate argument in the first place.
Right.
Let's take Maine, for example. Maine generally, recently, has cast its electors toward the Democratic candidate. The Democratic candidate has won the popular vote in 8 of the 9 last elections at the time of this recording.
Right.
The argument here suggests that they would rather their votes not matter because the Electoral College will choose a candidate other than the one they elected, so that they could have the chance that the candidate will campaign in their state, which they're already not doing. The logic of this is so massively flawed from start to end that it is a complete nonsense thing to say. It'd be like, we should keep the Electoral College because I'm like, those aren't words.
No, I mean, there are some people that heard that and understood it.
Yeah. I'm like, you said nothing, but it's almost worse than that because it's just backwards. All of it's wrong. There's literally not one part of that argument that holds water. So
Right.
Let's move on from that part.
Yes. So the last idea that votes in geographical minorities wouldn't matter is egregiously incorrectly. And so it's so incorrect that as to be the opposite of true. Like it could not be further from the truth. But it also is saying the quiet part out loud. If we eliminate the Electoral College, then the candidate with the majority of votes wins, period. Right? This means that every person's vote counts as one vote. And we've kind of said this multiple times. One person equals one vote, and that's a nice idea, right? The Electoral College preserves a system in which some people's votes count more than others. And that's exactly what happens. So instead of one-to-one correspondence, what you've got is in some states, a vote counts for less, and in other states, a vote counts for more, depending on how it's weighted. The Electoral College is simply a weighted system.
Yeah. It puts its thumb on the scale of elections to push it towards certain candidates.
Right.
And again, this is specifically not what people want.
Right.
It is specifically not what people are choosing. It is asking people what they want and then doing the opposite. Like, why did you even ask?
Right.
What was the point? So to segue to this is a related point. So they say this, like, the most highly populated cities and states would decide the election. No, they fucking wouldn't. First of all, cities don't vote. States don't vote. Land does not have an election card. Land does not get to vote in things. One person, one vote, as we've said. That should be the rule. Cities don't vote for candidates. States don't vote for candidates. People vote for candidates. The idea that large cities would select the president implies that those people have more votes than people in smaller areas. Do they have more votes than people in smaller areas? No, they do not.
No.
They have one vote. One person, one vote. That is what we're suggesting here. One person living in Chicago gets one vote. One person living in Ely, Nevada gets one vote. They each get a vote.
Yeah.
The argument that they are making is that people in rural areas should get more votes because that way they can have more power in elections than people who live in highly populated areas. They're arguing that if you happen to live just for whatever reason, circumstances brought you to an area with a lot of people, your vote shouldn't count as much. It should count less. If you happen to live, for whatever circumstance that brought you to it, to a place that has fewer people, your vote should count for more. And that's just wrong. Like, that's wrong. We're asking people to choose their elected leaders and then ignoring that choice.
Right.
Again, it just so happens to be the case that, like, where you end up is where you end up. If I were to just move you somewhere else, would your opinion suddenly change about that candidate? Unlikely.
Right.
There's really no reason to think that it would. So, and I think we'll make that point, but I just want to make sure we're really clear. This whole idea that, like, well, we give too much power to the cities. I'm like, no, we would count all the people who vote who happen to be located there.
Right.
Let's take California, for example, a very solidly Democratic state. It has voted for Democrats in the last several elections. There are millions of Republican voters there whose votes are not being counted.
Right.
Because the electoral system sends all of their delegates to support the Democratic candidate. And we were talking about this earlier. Like, the argument that states would choose electors assumes that somehow states retain an electoral system after we've gotten rid of it. We're saying that system is gone. Like, this argument just doesn't make any sense because, again, states would no longer be choosing presidents. Just votes would be.
Right. Right. So let's take that. Let's do a thought experiment for a second. Let's pretend that we reallocated people so that every single city in this country had the same exact number of people. Those people are not going to change their vote because they are now in a different area. Now, the size of the city doesn't matter, and the candidate with the most votes always wins every election. Would we be okay with that? Would you all be okay with that? There's a lot of people that would not be okay with that just because it's not what we've always done. But because this isn't about fair, equal representation, it is about maintaining an unfair, unequal representation based on land, not people.
Right. So they literally said in their argument that the person who wins the most votes shouldn't necessarily win the election. That's what they said.
Yep.
The candidate who wins the most votes should not win the election. What the f***?
That's weird.
Regardless of whatever follows in their argument, this is an asinine statement. If their candidate was the one who kept winning the vast majority of votes, but losing because a system more heavily weighted the votes of their opponent, I strongly doubt that they would keep making an argument to keep the system. The only argument is they don't like how the outcomes would be shaped because they would lose the votes.
Right.
And I think what would happen ultimately if we got rid of this system is people would have to be less extreme. You would have to pick better candidates because your candidate won't win if you keep picking terrible candidates.
Right.
Pick better candidates, then they'll win all the votes. So that's essentially what would be incentivized by eliminating the Electoral College system, is having better candidates who are not so extreme. What a crime.
I know. Isn't it wild to think that that's like something that is well within our grasp, but never happens because people are too up their own butts about their political party?
I mean, and just the arguments here, they don't make sense. They don't stand on their own. They're counterproductive across the board. The only argument, like the only thing they're actually saying really here is, we know we're going to lose this election because we have terrible candidates and terrible policies. So we're going to change the system, the system favors us already, but we are going to have a system whereby we can still win sometimes. I'm like, that's not the system anybody here wants. We are specifically choosing not that. And it's pushing things to the extremes. So it is just a colossal, fantastic failure. I'll share more of my opinion about this, if not that I haven't done so generously so far, but there is actually more to say after we sit through some more advertisements.
So there are some other arguments to consider when we're talking about this, as if there's not hundreds and hundreds of arguments. I mean, the real argument should just be one person, one vote. That's what it should be. But there are, to unpack this more, there's this thing called faithless electors. And these are people who don't vote according to the majority in their states. So you might have a situation where the majority of a state votes one way and the elector votes the opposite, different way. And sometimes it's legal and sometimes it's not, depending on how it's codified in state law.
This is actually sort of an interesting thing to unpack. This is probably a good place for this.
Yeah.
Is some have raised the argument. So like some states, the Supreme Court in some states has upheld that if an elector did not vote for the candidate that won the majority of that state's votes, in some states, they are like prosecuted. They are prevented from holding that position any longer, and they are not allowed to participate in related activities. And the Supreme Court upheld that, saying you basically did not do your job. Your job here was to vote in accordance with the popular vote of your state. You did not do that. You no longer get to hold this position.
Right.
Other states have gone the opposite direction, where they had faithless electors who chose someone other than who that candidate selected and cast their electoral vote toward a different candidate who did not win the popularity of that state. And the Supreme Court of that state said instead, you have the right to do whatever you want. This is not spelled out in the Constitution, whether you have to vote with accordance to the state's popular vote. It was kind of implied, but it wasn't actually spelled out. So you get to sort of vote your conscience, if you will, and choose whatever candidate you think is in line with your values, which again, then distills the millions of people's votes down into like 10 people. And one of those people then counts for 10% of that state's power. That is a ludicrous, ridiculous amount of power for that person to have.
Right. It's absurd.
Okay. There's another thing that we talked about in the first episode, that the very first instance in which the person who won the popular vote did not become president was actually because they had so many candidates who won such a large proportion of the vote. They had 4. And in that situation, the vote goes to Congress to decide who wins. but they only decide on the top 3. So the fourth place person threw all of their political power behind the second place person and got that person elected. What happened was they basically went to that second candidate and said, hey, you make me your Secretary of State and I will throw all of my political might behind you becoming the president. So what happens is sending the vote to Congress can incentivize these sort of insider deals and corruption, because you have people sort of, again, they're undercutting the vote of the people and they're doing under the table back alley deals to just maintain power, like making promises to each other, some quid pro quos, as we've heard said. And like that just is a recipe for corruption that we definitely are trying to avoid in general in a functioning government.
Right. There's also the argument that because most of the country's like GDP is concentrated in most densely populated areas and the more densely populated areas, you know, we have this issue that ultimately they have less representation, even though there is more money and economy and all the stuff happening inside of these larger populations, right? There's more stuff happening in these larger epicenters of the cities, and they arguably get less representation because of the way the Electoral College is set up.
Yeah, it's almost like the bulk of our economy is handled by these places where the most people happen to be. And then we're giving them the least amount of voting power. Like if we were going to inequitably distribute voting power, wouldn't we be distributing it toward the places that make our economy thrive the most?
Right.
And so, I mean, I would say, no, let's not unequally distribute power at all. But that would be going literally the opposite way it's currently going. And so they're sort of making the argument that it's so wrong, it's backwards if it was going to be any way, if the scales are going to be tipped any one way.
Yeah. And I think when you think about it, and this is something that like, and we'll talk about this in a second too, but I think when you hear people say, well, why would I vote? Your votes don't matter. Like there is a system in place that has effectively made people feel like that. Like this system, the way that it is designed and the way the Electoral College works is effectively made people feel like their votes don't matter, because ultimately, if I vote one way in a state that gives all the electoral votes another way, then sure, my vote didn't really matter. Yeah. In that elector, at least for the president, right? And we could talk all day about local elections and how important they are too, but like arguably it makes sense that people have a certain feeling about this.
Yeah, and I think I've never really liked that argument very much, and I'll just say a quick piece on that, which is like, you are correct that when you have lost, your voice did not really count for anything because none of your voting power went to supporting the candidate you wanted to support. And right. I understand that sentiment. I've also heard like, well, my vote's not going to be the one that tips the scales. I'm like, it should never be that way. That's a dictatorship or like a monarchy that we're talking about. One person should not have that kind of power. The point is you participate in having your voice heard and be represented. And also going back to just the main argument of like your voice didn't matter is like that person still did win because they had enough votes that the electoral votes of that state went to the candidate.
Right.
So they did have to have all those people voting for them. It wasn't any one person in there that did it. It was all the people together. You know, when you lose, that's a bummer. And it definitely is not fair that your voice doesn't count toward supporting the candidate you chose. But like, if enough people had supported the candidate, your voice would have been a part of that.
Right.
And so the defeatist attitude of like, well, it's not going to matter. I'm like, I do understand in a way, but also consider like that's essentially how candidates lose also.
Right, exactly.
I did have a question. We were kind of wondering, like, how are electors even selected? You get these like faithless electors and that sort of thing. Apparently, there's only a couple rules that were sort of spelled out, and then there was different ways that it had been handled. Essentially, the only thing that's specified in the Constitution states that you just can't be a member of Congress or hold federal office. That's pretty much it. Anyone else could potentially be an elector. But they said basically states, you figure out how you want to choose your electors. Now, until about the mid 1800s or so, the legislators would just appoint electors. They just say, you're going to be an elector. That was an appointed position. Most commonly anymore, the state party convention chooses electors, and they have like nominated a slate of electors that they'll vote on at the convention, and then those electors become the electors for the state. In some states, electors are chosen by a vote of the state's party central committee,
right?
But it seems like most states have this. Each political party state convention will select their electors, and it seems like a lot of time these are people who serve in other government roles in the state. So again, they can't have federal office, they can't be in Congress, but it seems like it's probably a lot of people who have other government roles who end up being the electors for that state.
Right. So where do we go from here? I mean, it's a mess. So what do we do?
Yeah, so a lot of people are dissatisfied with the electoral system. As we mentioned in the first episode, we talked about that when polled, most people say that they think we should get rid of the system. Again, right now, our voices are not super well represented in government, so it seems unlikely that change would happen, but most people are in favor of this. So there is this path forward. Someone put forth this idea. I saw his name, but I didn't write it down, and I forgot what it was, but he was like a big political person. They put together this idea to essentially undercut the Electoral College. It's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, sometimes abbreviated as NPV, as National Popular Vote, or NPVIC for the Interstate Compact part. And this is an agreement between states to send their electoral votes to whoever wins the popular vote, not necessarily the candidate that their state selected. Essentially meaning that, like, let's just say, I'm in Nevada. Let's just say that Nevada happens to vote for, realistically, let's say Nevada happens to vote for Donald Trump with the majority of people here. But the popular vote went to Kamala Harris.
Right.
The state would then send all of their electoral votes to Kamala Harris because she won the popular vote, and not to Donald Trump because he did not win the popular vote, even though the majority of the state did.
Right.
And so essentially that would undercut entirely the idea of the Electoral College, because the candidate who won the popular vote would also just get all of the electoral votes in this agreement. So far, 17 states representing 209 electoral votes, which is 39% of the Electoral College, have signed on to this agreement. Another 5 states are pending approval, representing 50 more electoral votes for a total of 259. To win an election, a candidate must have 270 electoral votes, so they are only 11 away.
Right.
However, the system will only go into effect if they can reach the majority needed, that 270 votes, to secure an election. So they are just 11 electoral votes shy, assuming that the pending states complete their agreement process, of going to a system wherein at least 270 electoral votes would be guaranteed to go to the candidate who won the popular vote. It would literally get rid of the electoral system. I mean, it would also disenfranchise all the voters in that state who voted for the candidate who didn't get elected, and hence it's still not better than a popular vote, but it would completely undercut the original intention of the Electoral College, which was to give more power to fewer people.
It would be the thing that would demonstrate that the Electoral College can be broken. And yes, that's the thing I think that needs to be seen, is like, it's that whole idea of like in 300 where it's like he didn't have to win, he just had to make God bleed, right? And so like, you know, and that's really what has to happen. It's like we have relied so heavily on this system for so long that if you showed that it can be broken by simply making an agreement or a compact, like if you can do that, then ultimately the system had not enough power to sustain anyway. So it was time to undo the system.
Well, obviously, this was proposed because they think the system is broken as it is. Like, it's clearly not representing the will of the voters. But I know we have people who listen to us who are not Democrats. So let's spin this as a hypothetical in your favor. Let's say you're planning on supporting Donald Trump in the upcoming election. Let's say that states including California and New York were on board with this plan to send their electors toward the popular candidate. Let's say that Donald Trump wins the popular vote but loses the Electoral College. In this new system, even California, having voted completely for the Democratic candidate, would send all of their electoral votes for Donald Trump because he won the popular vote, assuming they were part of this group of states who had agreed to this.
Right.
So in that case, it would guarantee that having won the popular vote secured him the candidacy. You can see why you'd look at that, because like imagine how frustrated you would be if he won the popular vote and then lost the Electoral College. That's how the other half has felt the last several elections,
right?
Where that has actually been the case. So again, it's really about securing fairness in the elections by ensuring that the candidate who is chosen by the people becomes the leader.
Right. Well, and I think also too, I could see people going like, I don't know about that. But at the end of the day, when you think about the 2016 election and the way the votes went in California, when you really think about it, it's the same kind of thing. Like you didn't win.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's a blue state that went into red territory. Like it went into a red presidency, a blue state that went into a red presidency, essentially. Right. And so you didn't win with the way the system works as it is. So why not change it up anyway to see what happens? Like, I don't know why we wouldn't want to try to shake it up a little bit, spice it up.
The whole point here is that everyone's vote should count. Everyone's vote should count.
Yeah.
Everyone's vote should count exactly the same as everyone else's vote. Because just as you said, like when you're in a state that heavily favors one party over the other consistently, and you're not in that majority, then like how disenfranchising for you to literally never have your vote counted toward the candidate that you support. If you throw your vote behind a candidate who doesn't win, like if we move to a popular vote, let's say, at least your vote was counted for that person's support.
Right.
Right?
At the minimum.
At the minimum. If you throw your vote behind the candidate who did win, your vote was part of what helped that happen. And right now, if you throw your vote behind the candidate who wins the popular vote but loses the election, that is so enormously frustrating and so counterproductive and so backward. It is just wrong. Every part of it is wrong. It is like homeowners associations. We should throw it in the ditch, set it on fire, and write in history books what a terrible, terrible mistake it was that we ever had this in the first place.
Yes.
I was going to share my opinion. When I first started doing like the research to put together the notes for this discussion, I was like already in favor of the idea of removing or maybe just restructuring the Electoral College before I sort of got into this. I remember thinking like, this feels like this is not a very good system. But I also heard arguments for people saying this, like, we do need to preserve this system. It has an important function.
Right.
And so I went into this with an open mind thinking, I want to know what those arguments for. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe my opinion about this has been all askew. But then I learned about the system, and I went from being moderately in favor of eliminating it to being a vehement advocate for the immediate abolition of the Electoral College.
Yeah.
Immediate. Let's not wait.
Yeah.
Do it tomorrow. Do it yesterday. It is a garbage system that is terrible for our country. It is terrible for democracy. It sets a terrible precedent, and it sucks.
It doesn't work.
Burn it. Throw it away. It does not work.
Yeah, I think it's a good take-home point.
you could call it that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna say I'm not. It's funny is I'm in the same boat. Like, I never really understood why it was a thing, and it never made sense to me logically. And then going into this, you're like, oh yeah, no, this is like just bad.
Yeah.
For everybody involved.
Yeah, it's like you might find it a little confusing and a little weird, and then you learn about it, and you're like, wow, this is amazingly stupid. This is not a good idea.
It's intentionally confusing.
Yeah, this was like a deliberately bad, belligerently bad idea.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I think that's what we have to say about the Electoral College.
We nailed it.
We nailed it. Why do people do it? because they were very cynical and had bad ideas and were not thinking clearly, and then they wrote that into a policy that couldn't be changed, even though people have tried over 700 times to change it. And so we've had a really tough go of it. We have had a system that is, it had mostly not mattered that it was a bad system for a long time. And now we're at the point where it is so cracked and frayed, it is basically just a crumbly turd that is trying to destroy our country. So just flush that turd. Let's start over with a clean toilet.
Yeah, that's the take-home point.
All right, well, we can wrap it up there. Is there anything you'd like to add? Because I didn't really give you a chance to share much about your thoughts on this before we transition to some recommendations.
No, I think we nailed it. I think that's exactly where I would have landed on that.
Okay, lovely. Well, if you are not familiar with our format here, we like to recommend some fun things that are just unrelated to our topic. They're just things we're recommending. But before I do that, I must review the credits. Thank you so much for joining us and for listening. If you would like to support our show, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, you can join us on Patreon. There you get ad-free episodes, early episodes, bonus content, all that sort of good thing. And you get to help support what we do, which we very much appreciate. You can also support us non-financially by leaving us a rating and a review, subscribing, telling a friend, liking, sharing, do all that sort of thing. And you can also pick up some merch if you want to just have some cool podcast merch to sport around, which is always very good. And all of that's very lovely. Also, if you join us on Patreon, something else important happens, which is that I am going to read your name to thank you for throwing your support behind us. And that includes Mike M, Megan, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, Ashley, Kiara, and Michelle. Thank you all. You are just so wonderful, and I just really, really appreciate who you have been for us for so long.
Absolutely. Y'all are just absolutely, truly the best.
Of course, thank you to my team of people without whom I would have a very difficult time making a podcast. Writing and fact-checking from Shane and myself. Our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson, and the audio that sounds like two people having a cohesive conversation brought to you courtesy of Justin, who I unfortunately made work much harder on this episode than he should have to, but I do appreciate his efforts. So thank you, Justin, for being so patient with me.
You're the best.
All right. Now, I think that's all I have. Is there anything that I am forgetting before we transition to our recommendations?
Not today, no.
Okay. Let's recommend some things.
Yay! Recommendations.
As I have been on my high ranty horse lately, I'll let you start with the recommendations.
So I'm going to recommend a book. I recently finished a book called Naked by David Sedaris.
Okay.
So have you ever read David Sedaris?
I don't think so, no.
I feel like you would really appreciate...
I have been naked, though.
That's true. Many of us have. Can't say all of us. There's never a certainty. Okay, so this David Sedaris is a short story kind of like... I want to say autobiographical writer. A lot of his books are a collection of short stories about his family, about kind of his experiences, and some of them are just very outlandish. He's got a very strange sense of humor. So like in Calypso, which is like one of his later books, he wrote the story about how he had gotten a fatty tumor removed, but he didn't want to go to an American hospital. So he crossed the border and got it cut out in like the garage in somebody in Mexico.
Whoa.
And then had the tumor mailed to himself, put it in the freezer so he could feed it to a snapping turtle in North Carolina.
Sure. As one does.
Yeah, as one does. So Naked is one of his earlier collections of short stories. And it's really kind of like talks about his early life and how he would hitchhike and some of the trouble he got into and just some of the characters he meets along the way. Really fascinating to kind of, you kind of go, this isn't real. There's no way this happened. And then for the most part, yeah, I mean, there might be some like language embellishments here and there, but for the most part, his experiences are all real. And you just kind of go, this sounds like it's all made up on such a level that like, it's stranger than fiction, really. Huh. He's written a bunch of things. His sister is Amy Sedaris, who was the main character on Strangers with Candy.
Yeah.
And like she's a comedian, she's a popular comedian.
I thought that name sounded familiar.
Yeah, so David Sedaris is her sibling, and he's written so much stuff, and Naked is probably one of his best. Huh. So I definitely recommend it as a fun read.
All right.
I say fun. There are some harrowing stories in it, but it is an interesting read, I'll say.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Live fast, write a book. This is Naked by David Sedaris. All right.
Yes.
I've been on a huge movie watching streak lately. I really stepped up my movie watching game, which makes me just feel all the happy joys.
Sure.
One I had the pleasure of watching that came out, I believe, a year ago or so, is a new standalone installment of the genre of monster movies known as Godzilla. And this is Godzilla -1. Man, what a fantastic movie. It is maybe, I mean, I have not seen all of the Godzilla movies, but it is definitely the best one I have ever seen. It is really, really spectacularly done. And so the director, as I understand it, the director like originally worked as a visual effects artist. So he really knew how to direct and set up a movie where you could capitalize on visual effects the best. And this movie only cost them, if I remember correctly, like $15 million to make.
Yeah.
And while that sounds like an absurd amount of money to you or I, who like will never see $15 million collectively in our entire lifetime, that's like a drop in the bucket relative to how much other Godzilla movies cost, or any movies for that matter, that are in the hundreds of millions of dollars range, or even more than that.
For perspective, Avengers Endgame cost $356 million to make.
Great. That is...
Yeah.
That is more than 10 times more what Godzilla cost to make.
Yeah.
I saw this on Netflix. I'm sure it won't be up there forever, but that's at least where it was streaming at the time that we're recording this. So if you're interested in monster movies, this one, as I said, is probably the best Godzilla movie I have ever seen. And I have seen quite a few, although not many of the super, super old ones. Which I'm sure are also great in their own way. All right, I think that is all that I have. Godzilla -1, the movie, and Naked, the book by David Sedaris. And if you would like to tell us about your thoughts about the Electoral College or Godzilla movies or books called Naked, you should certainly reach out to us. You can email us directly at info@wwd.podcast.com. You can reach us on the social media platforms. And if you'd like to leave us some constructive criticism, you can also reach out to us directly, and we will happily hear that. If you have some nonsense things to say, then you can certainly say them and we'll just ignore you. But we do appreciate heaping piles of praise, and we also appreciate constructive criticism because we really value learning on this show. That's pretty much why we do it, so we can learn stuff. That's why we do what we do.
That's exactly why we do what we do.
So anyway, I think that is all that I have to say. Thank you for listening. Is there anything that you would like to add or anything that I forgot before we wrap up here?
Nothing on my end.
Okay, thank you. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.